In today's chilling story, we'll dive into the mysterious disappearance of not just one woman, but dozens, vanishing across multiple states, leaving behind no signs of struggle, no evidence, and for years, no answers. At the center of this web of terror was a man who didn't look like a monster. A man who smiled, held doors open, and studied law. But behind that charming exterior was something much darker. Something unthinkable. Welcome to The Hidden Truth, True Crime Story. Today we expose the truth behind one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, Theodore Robert Bundy. Ted Bundy. A name that still echoes in courtrooms, universities, and true crime documentaries. But who was he before the horror began? What forces shaped the man who would become a murderer? To understand the killer, we must first understand the boy. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, at a home for unwed mothers. From the moment of his birth, his life was steeped in deception. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was just 22 years old when she gave birth to him. Fearing the stigma of single motherhood in the conservative 1940s, Eleanor left her baby at the home while she considered adoption. But eventually she decided to raise him, though not as her son. Instead, Ted was raised believing that Eleanor was his sister and that his grandparents were his parents. That single lie, repeated for years, would become the foundation of a life built on deception. As a young child, Bundy was described as shy and intelligent, but also deeply isolated. He had a fascination with knives and an unusual calmness about dark subjects. Neighbors would later recount unsettling memories, like how young Ted once surrounded his aunt with knives while she slept, his face blank, his eyes empty. When Ted was 4, Eleanor took him to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Bundy, a hospital cook. Johnny formally adopted Ted, giving him the name he'd carry into infamy, Ted Bundy. But Ted never truly accepted Johnny. He saw him as uneducated and beneath him. That sense of superiority, even in childhood, would remain a key part of Bundy's psychological makeup. As he grew older, Ted became more withdrawn. He struggled socially, often retreating into fantasies. He began shoplifting, peeping through windows, and developing a fixation on control and dominance. In high school, he appeared relatively normal on the outside. He skied, dated, and attended church. But inside, the fantasy life was growing, festering into something that would soon become violent. College brought more change. Bundy attended several universities, including the University of Puget Sound and later University of Washington, where he studied psychology. Ironically, he was fascinated with the criminal mind. He even worked at a suicide crisis hotline, helping to save lives at night, while quietly planning how he might one day take them. One of his co-workers was crime author Anne Rule, who later wrote one of the definitive books on him, The Stranger Beside Me. She described him as kind, empathetic, and even heroic. A chilling reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Ted's first serious relationship was with a wealthy, sophisticated woman who fit the mold of many of his later victims, long dark hair, parted in the middle. But when she ended the relationship, Bundy was devastated. Some believe this breakup triggered something deep inside him. A wound he would try to correct by seeking out women who looked like her. Over and over again. But the truth is, the darkness was always there. The breakup didn't cause it, it simply gave it focus. By the early 1970s, Ted Bundy was studying law and volunteering in political campaigns. People described him as charismatic, articulate, even presidential. He knew exactly how to say the right things, how to appear trustworthy, how to charm everyone in the room. But beneath that surface was a man already planning his first abduction. Already dreaming of control. Already waiting for night to fall. And so, the transformation was nearly complete. From a boy wrapped in lies to a man cloaked in charm. From a psychology student to a predator. From Ted Bundy to the shadow that would haunt America for years to come. In the next chapter, we'll look at how Ted Bundy managed to deceive everyone around him. Friends, family, co-workers, even police. We'll explore the double life he led, and how for a while he seemed almost untouchable. Section 2. The Mask of Normalcy. As the 1970s unfolded, Ted Bundy was becoming everything society told him he should be. Educated, polite, clean-cut. He wore sweaters and khakis, spoke in a soft, intelligent tone, and carried himself with a strange kind of practiced humility. But behind the mask of normalcy was a predator in disguise, watching, waiting, perfecting the art of deception. At the University of Washington, Bundy majored in psychology, which gave him insights into human behavior that he would later use for horrifying purposes. He didn't just study the mind, he studied how to manipulate it, how to mimic empathy, how to blend in. Even his professors were impressed by his intelligence and drive. He seemed destined for a bright future, and no one suspected a thing. In the early 1970s, he began working for the Washington State Republican Party. He attended fundraisers, shook hands with politicians, and even received praise from top officials. There was talk of him one day running for office. Few people realized that the man smiling for photographs was already starting to fantasize about abduction and murder. By all appearances, he was charming, driven, and trustworthy. A perfect mask. Bundy was also in a long-term relationship with a woman named Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother who described him as loving and attentive. They took weekend trips, cooked dinner together, and shared a seemingly normal life. But Bundy's charm wasn't love, it was control. Elizabeth would later describe moments where his behavior shifted, times he disappeared without explanation, lied about where he'd been, or returned home acting strangely detached. Still, he never raised enough suspicion. That's how convincing his mask was. Even the people closest to him had no idea what he was capable of. Meanwhile, Ted was developing a second persona. One that thrived on fantasy, secrecy, and control. He began frequenting libraries and crime archives, studying the cases of notorious killers. He followed news stories about missing women. And he took notes. Carefully. Quietly. Strategically. What made Bundy so dangerous wasn't just his cunning, it was his adaptability. He knew exactly how to present himself in any situation. To women he was gentle and courteous. To employers he was confident and capable. To police officers he was cooperative and polite. But behind every interaction was a lie. The real Ted Bundy was a shapeshifter. He started to practice his manipulation in low-risk situations. Shoplifting, peering into windows, pretending to be injured to gain sympathy. He would walk through public parks with a cast on his arm, dropping books or fumbling with car keys, waiting for a kind stranger to help. It was all rehearsal. Rehearsal for something darker. The disturbing genius of Bundy's strategy was that it relied on people's decency, their willingness to help someone in need. He weaponized kindness. And it worked. At the same time, his ambition began to falter. Bundy applied to law school and was accepted to several programs, including the University of Utah. But once inside he struggled. The coursework was difficult and his performance inconsistent. The image of the brilliant student began to crack. He dropped out, frustrated and disillusioned. Behind closed doors, his fantasies began to consume him entirely. He no longer wanted to pretend to have power. He wanted to take it. In the summer of 1974, something shifted. Women in the Pacific Northwest began to disappear. One by one. Always young. Always brunette. Always beautiful. They vanished in broad daylight, often in crowded areas. There were no screams. No signs of struggle. Just silence and then nothing. Police were baffled. There was no apparent pattern. No suspect. Just fear spreading like wildfire across college campuses. People began locking their doors. Women walked in groups. And still the disappearances continued. What no one knew at the time was that the killer was hiding in plain sight. Smiling at the grocery store. Helping neighbors carry groceries. Even attending candlelight vigils for the very women he had murdered. Ted Bundy had mastered the art of the double life. And while he played the role of model citizen by day, he became something else entirely at night. Something terrifying. Something unstoppable. In the next part of our story, we'll take a closer look at the first known murders, the tactics he used, the terrifying level of planning, and how the legend of Ted Bundy truly began. The facade was cracking and the truth was about to come into the light. Section 3. First Murders and Pattern Emergence. The year was 1974, and fear had begun to settle like fog across college campuses in the Pacific Northwest. Young women were vanishing without a trace, leaving behind their books, their cars, their entire lives. No signs of forced entry. No bodies. Just silence and suspicion. Somewhere, someone was hunting. And his name was Ted Bundy. By this time, Bundy had already refined his method. He wasn't impulsive. He didn't leave blood trails or scenes of chaos. He was calculating. Cold. Controlled. His weapon wasn't just brutality, it was trust. And he used it to disarm his victims long before he ever laid a hand on them. The first known victim was Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old University of Washington student. On the morning of January 31, 1974, she didn't show up for her job reading weather reports for a local radio station. Friends who went to check on her found her bed neatly made, with one eerie detail. Her pillowcase was stained with blood. Her clothes were missing. So was she. There were no signs of a break-in. It was as if she had been plucked from her own home in the dead of night. It was the beginning of a pattern. And it wouldn't stop there. In the following months, more women disappeared. Donna Gail Manson in March, Susan Elaine Rancourt in April, Roberta Kathleen Parks in May, Brenda Carol Ball in June. All of them were college students. All of them were last seen near campuses. And all of them vanished without a sound. Each crime scene was eerily clean. Too clean. Bundy took time to eliminate evidence. He understood how police worked. He studied their methods and he stayed one step ahead. But it was more than intelligence, it was rehearsal. He'd spent years imagining these crimes before committing them. And now he was living them out. Bundy's tactics were methodical. He would often wear a fake cast or arm sling, approach a woman in a public place, like a library or a parking lot, and ask for help loading something into his car. He'd flash a boyish smile. Act awkward. Vulnerable. Once the victim let her guard down, he would strike. Quick. Precise. Controlled. And then he'd disappear. With her. It was only after multiple disappearances that police began to connect the dots. Witnesses in several locations mentioned seeing a man with a sling or cast, driving a Volkswagen Beetle, and introducing himself as Ted. It was a rare slip, one of the few times Bundy left a breadcrumb behind. But even then, police had no idea who Ted really was. That summer, on July 14, 1974, Bundy committed one of his boldest and most horrifying acts. In broad daylight at Lake Sammamish State Park, he approached multiple women using the same ruse, an injured arm needing help with his sailboat. Two of those women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, would never be seen alive again. Witnesses came forward. They'd seen him, spoken to him. And for the first time a composite sketch was made. A name was whispered. Still it wasn't enough. Bundy's charm, his lack of criminal record, and his all-American image protected him like armor. But behind closed doors, Bundy was spiraling deeper into violence. His crimes were escalating. He wasn't just killing, he was returning to the scenes, reliving the moments. Some of the remains were found decapitated. Others were left in remote, wooded areas. And always there was an eerie quiet that followed each murder. No boasts. No letters to the police. Just disappearance and death. In August of 1974, Bundy packed up and moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, enrolling in law school. A fresh start. A new hunting ground. And soon the cycle would begin again. The murders in Washington slowed, but only because he was starting all over again somewhere else. To the public he was just another student. another face in the crowd. But the killings had already crossed state lines. And that meant one thing: Ted Bundy was no longer just a murderer. He was now a multi-state serial killer, one of the first to be tracked by what would soon become the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Still, no one had put it all together yet. Not the universities. Not the police. Not even the FBI. Bundy moved like a ghost, changing his name, his tactics, his story. But the one thing he never changed was his hunger. In the next part of our story, we'll follow Bundy to Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, where the pattern not only continued, it grew more violent, more brazen, and more unthinkable. The net was closing in. But Ted Bundy had one more trick up his sleeve. And this time he would escape. Section 4, Multi-State Killing Spree. By late 1974, the quiet unease that had gripped the Pacific Northwest seemed to ease. The disappearances that had once haunted Washington and Oregon had stopped, or so it seemed. In truth, the danger hadn't ended. It had moved. Ted Bundy had relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah, enrolling in law school and presenting himself as a man starting fresh. But while he studied case law by day, his darker compulsions had followed him across state lines. It wasn't long before young women in Utah began vanishing under similar, unexplained circumstances. In October of that year, a series of new disappearances were reported. The pattern felt all too familiar. Young women, last seen in public places, disappearing with no witnesses and no clear signs of foul play. Investigators were left with questions and no answers. But it wasn't just the cases that were similar. The method of approach remained consistent. Bundy often posed as someone in need of help, tapping into people's instinct to be kind, to lend a hand, to assist a stranger who seemed injured or in trouble. It was calculated, quiet, and devastating. One survivor, Carol Duranch, would later become key to understanding the extent of his crimes. After being approached by someone claiming to be a police officer, she grew suspicious during the interaction. Her instincts saved her, and she managed to escape and alert Real authorities. Her bravery not only prevented further harm to herself, it left behind a traceable link to the man behind the crimes. A few weeks later, in a nearby town, another young woman vanished. A small detail found at the scene, one that connected to the earlier incident involving Duranch, suggested that these cases were not isolated. For the first time, investigators in Utah began to suspect they were dealing with a pattern, not separate events. Then in August 1975, Bundy's name finally rose to the surface. He was pulled over during a routine traffic stop. Inside his car were items that raised red flags, things that didn't belong in a law student's vehicle. Although he provided explanations, they didn't quite hold up. Investigators grew more suspicious and placed him under surveillance. Searches were conducted. Witnesses identified him from composites. Eventually, Bundy was arrested and charged in connection with the Duranch case. In March 1976, he was convicted and sentenced. To the public, it seemed justice had finally caught up with him. But the story didn't end there. While awaiting trial for related charges in Colorado, Bundy made headlines again, not for violence but for escape. Not once but twice. His first escape came during a court hearing. Left alone to research his case, he slipped out of a courthouse window and vanished into the mountains. He was missing for nearly a week before being found and returned to custody. Months later, after meticulously planning in his cell, Bundy escaped again, this time making his way across the country to Florida. Now a fugitive, Bundy tried to disappear into the crowd. But even far from his previous crimes, his behavior escalated. He began targeting new victims. This time, however, it became harder to hide. In early 1978, he entered a university residence in Tallahassee in the middle of the night. What happened there shocked the community and made national headlines. Though details were tightly controlled out of respect for victims and their families, authorities described the event as a violent and alarming breach of public safety. It left multiple students injured and 2 young women lost their lives. Only days later, another tragedy occurred in a nearby town when a young girl named Kimberly Leach failed to return from school. This case too would later be tied to Bundy. His eventual arrest came on February 15, 1978, when he was pulled over by a patrol officer in northern Florida. By then, his true identity had caught up with him. Fingerprints confirmed it. Ted Bundy was back in custody. But this time the legal system was preparing for something much bigger. What followed would be called the trial of the century. A trial that would be broadcast, debated, and dissected like few others in American history. Bundy wasn't just a defendant. He became the face of a nightmare many people were only just beginning to understand. In the next part of our story, we'll take you into the courtroom where Bundy, now fully exposed, decided to take control of his own defense. Cameras rolled. Reporters swarmed. And Bundy seemed to relish the spotlight, even as his crimes were laid bare for the world to see. Section 5. The Trial of the Century. By early 1978, Ted Bundy was once again behind bars. But this time things were different. The evidence was mounting, the public was watching, and the system had learned its lesson. After years of slipping through the cracks, evading accountability, and escaping from custody, Bundy was now at the center of one of the most highly publicized trials in American history. It wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a national spectacle. Bundy was facing multiple charges, first for the attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee, and later for the tragic case involving 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Prosecutors knew they were dealing with a complex and deeply manipulative individual. Bundy wasn't just fighting to avoid prison. He was trying to control the narrative. From the moment proceedings began, Bundy chose to represent himself. For most defendants, this would have been seen as a desperate or ill-advised move. But Bundy wasn't like most defendants. He had studied law. He understood courtroom procedure. And more than anything, he craved control and attention. Acting as his own attorney gave him both. What unfolded in the courtroom was unlike anything seen before. Bundy cross-examined witnesses, made legal motions, and addressed the court with striking composure. At times, he was even charming, smiling at reporters, making offhand jokes, and presenting himself as calm, collected, and in command. The cameras captured everything. And the public, fascinated by the strange contradiction between his demeanor and the crimes he was accused of, watched closely. But behind the scenes, the truth was far less polished. Bundy's legal arguments were often unfocused. His court filings were disorganized. His knowledge of criminal law, while impressive for a layperson, wasn't enough to counter the strength of the evidence against him. And that evidence was growing. Witnesses from the Chi Omega house testified about the horrific events of that night. Police and forensic experts shared key findings. Most damaging of all, bite mark evidence that linked Bundy directly to one of the victims. It was the kind of physical proof that Bundy couldn't explain away. He attempted to discredit it, to cast doubt on the analysis, but the impact had already been made. As the trial unfolded, Bundy continued to make headlines, not just for the proceedings, but for his increasingly erratic behavior. He fired his legal team, rehired them, argued with the judge, spoke directly to reporters during breaks. He wasn't just defending himself in court. He was performing. But for whom? Some observers believed Bundy truly thought he could win, that his charm, intelligence, and manipulation would once again save him. Others saw it differently. They believed Bundy knew the end was near, and was simply trying to stretch out his moment in the spotlight for as long as possible. And then came the moment that stunned even the courtroom. During the penalty phase of the trial, while questioning a witness, Carol Ann Boone, a former co-worker and longtime supporter, Bundy suddenly proposed to her. On the record, in front of the judge and jury. She said yes. Under Florida law at the time, a declaration of marriage made in court and in the presence of a judge was legally binding. Just like that, Bundy married someone in the middle of a capital murder trial. To many it was a distraction. A final, twisted power play. But for Bundy, it may have been an attempt to humanize himself in the eyes of the jury, or perhaps a deeply personal way to reclaim a sense of control in a process where he was rapidly losing it. On July 24, 1979, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. On all counts. Bundy was sentenced to death for the Chi Omega attacks. Later, in a separate trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach, he received a second death sentence. The man who had once smiled for cameras and walked free despite growing suspicion was now confined to death row at Florida State Prison. But even in confinement, Bundy continued to manipulate. He gave interviews, wrote letters, delayed proceedings with appeals. For years he strung out the process, hoping perhaps for another escape or simply to stay alive long enough to shift the tide of public opinion. He remained a subject of fascination. True crime books and documentaries began to explore his case in detail. Experts in psychology studied him, analyzing his behavior, motivations, and the rare duality of his personality. Ted Bundy became more than just a criminal. He became a symbol of evil hidden behind a smile, of manipulation dressed in manners, and of how deeply a lie can be believed when it's delivered just right. In the next chapter of this story, we'll peel back the final layers. We'll look into Bundy's psychological profile, the cold logic beneath the charm, and the interviews he gave before his execution. We'll examine what made him different and what made him frighteningly familiar. Because the scariest truth of all may not be that monsters exist. It's that they can look just like us. Section 6. Psychological Profile and the Mind of a Killer. Even behind bars, Ted Bundy remained a mystery. How could someone so outwardly ordinary, even likable, be responsible for so many unspeakable acts? Why did he do it? What could possibly drive a man with education, ambition, and opportunity to take such a dark path? These are the questions that psychologists, criminologists, and forensic profilers have asked again and again. And the answers, while unsettling, offer a chilling glimpse into the mind of one of America's most infamous killers. From the start, Bundy's life was layered in contradiction. He was a man who studied psychology, but who used that knowledge to deceive. He volunteered for political campaigns, spoke eloquently, and wore the face of someone with promise. But behind that carefully crafted image was something far more dangerous. A compulsion for control, a lack of empathy, and a hunger for dominance. Experts who studied Bundy often pointed to key traits commonly associated with antisocial personality disorder, including manipulation, pathological lying, narcissism, and a complete absence of remorse. But Bundy was more than a textbook case. He was charming, persuasive. He understood how people worked and, more importantly, how to exploit that understanding. To many who met him, he seemed polite, articulate, and intelligent. He wasn't the stereotype of a criminal. That's part of what made him so frightening. His behavior didn't match the crimes he committed, at least not on the surface. But behind closed doors, his true personality emerged. Cold, detached, calculating. Bundy himself often spoke in vague terms about his actions. For years he denied any involvement in the disappearances. It was only when his final appeals began to run out, when execution was no longer a distant threat but an imminent reality, that he started to open up. In interviews he would refer to his crimes in the third person, as if they had been committed by someone else. As if detachment could lessen the weight of responsibility. In his final years, Bundy claimed he had been influenced by violent media, especially pornography. He said he had been consumed by dark fantasies that spiraled out of control. But many experts have disputed this explanation, viewing it as yet another manipulation, an attempt to shift blame, to position himself not as the architect of horror, but as its victim. There's no single event in Bundy's childhood that can explain what he became. While his early life was marked by deception and some troubling behavior, there were no obvious signs pointing to the monster he would later become. That absence of clear cause is what disturbs so many who study his case. It suggests that evil doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it wears a smile, holds a job, attends church, shakes hands, makes friends. What Bundy craved above all else was control. Not just over his victims but over how he was seen. He wanted to shape the narrative, to be the director of his own story. Even while on trial for multiple murders, he maintained the illusion that he could outwit the system, manipulate the media, and perhaps even sway public opinion. And in some ways he did. There were supporters. People who wrote to him, who defended him, who believed his innocence long after the evidence became undeniable. Some saw him as misunderstood. Others were drawn in by his charm. It's a phenomenon known as hybristophilia, a fascination with those who commit violent acts. Bundy's case became one of the most extreme examples of it in modern history. But beneath the public fascination lies something darker, the warning. Ted Bundy reminds us that danger doesn't always come with red flags or dramatic warnings. Sometimes it arrives dressed in normalcy. It knows how to look like a friend, how to mimic compassion, how to blend in. And when we ignore that possibility, we give it power. The final psychological evaluations conducted before Bundy's execution painted a picture of a man fully aware of what he had done. He wasn't delusional. He wasn't confused. He knew the difference between right and wrong, and chose wrong again and again. When asked in one of his final interviews if he felt remorse, Bundy answered carefully. He spoke about regret, about the lives lost. But it was what he didn't say, the emotions he didn't express, that haunted those who listened. It wasn't just what he had done. It was how little it seemed to weigh on him. In the final chapter of our story, we will return to where it ended. Death row. There, Ted Bundy spent his final days giving interviews, trying once more to control the narrative. And finally, on the morning of January 24, 1989, he faced the consequences he had evaded for so long. But even in death, the questions linger. How many more victims were there? What didn't we learn in time? And how do we protect ourselves from the next monster who looks like a neighbor? Section 7. Death, Legacy, and the Lingering Shadow. In the early morning hours of January 24, 1989, a crowd gathered outside Florida State Prison. Some held signs. Others shouted. And as the clock struck 7:16 a.m., word spread. Ted Bundy was dead. The man who had evaded justice for years, who had manipulated courtrooms and headlines, had finally reached the end of his story. But the scars he left behind were permanent, and the questions just as haunting as ever. Bundy had spent nearly a decade on death row, exhausting appeal after appeal. During that time, he gave interviews to psychologists, law enforcement, and journalists. Some were calculated efforts to delay the inevitable. Others, perhaps, were last attempts to shape how he would be remembered. In one of his final interviews, Bundy finally began to confess to what the world already suspected. He admitted to over 30 murders, but investigators believed the real number was likely much higher. He offered no full list. No closure for the family still waiting. Just fragments. Pieces of a story he had always controlled, and never fully revealed. For the families of the victims, his execution brought mixed emotions. Some expressed relief. Others said it brought no true comfort. Because while Bundy was gone, the void left by their daughters, sisters, and friends remained. For them, justice didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the final chapter in a book they never asked to be written. Bundy's death marked the end of a legal saga that had gripped the country. But it also sparked a broader conversation. About how we recognize danger. About how our systems respond to it. And about how easily someone can hide in plain sight. He wasn't the first serial killer. But in many ways he was the first media-age killer. His trials broadcast on television, his photos splashed across newspapers, his name embedded in the national psyche. He knew how to play to an audience. He understood performance. And the spotlight often gave him exactly what he wanted. Attention. But beyond the headlines and public fascination, Bundy's crimes changed how law enforcement approached serial cases. The efforts to track him across multiple states helped push the FBI to develop more structured methods for criminal profiling and case coordination. The behavioral analysis unit grew in both reach and influence, learning from what had been missed in Bundy's case. Technology would also evolve. Bundy was convicted largely on witness testimony and forensic evidence available at the time. Today, advances in DNA analysis and digital databases might have stopped him much sooner. His case became a painful lesson, one that reshaped how missing person cases and serial investigations are handled. And then there's the cultural legacy, one far more difficult to define. Bundy's crimes inspired books, films, documentaries, podcasts. Some aimed to explore, others to sensationalize. But all of them fed into the lingering fascination with how someone who looked so normal could hide such darkness. It's a dangerous fascination. Because when we turn people like Bundy into legends, we risk forgetting what truly matters. The victims. Their names, their stories, their lives deserve more space than the man who took them away. They were daughters, students, friends, young women with dreams and futures whose stories were tragically cut short. As the years pass, Bundy's image has become a case study, an example of what manipulation, narcissism, and unchecked violence can look like when cloaked in charm. He reminds us that the greatest threats don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they shake your hand. Sometimes they blend in so completely you don't see them until it's too late. Ted Bundy's chapter is closed. But the shadow he cast remains. And so, we remember the names of the victims. We honor the survivors who bravely came forward. And we reflect on the systems that must continue to evolve, to protect, to prevent, and to ensure that someone like Ted Bundy is never able to walk freely among us again. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the darkest cases in modern history. If this story gripped you, moved you, or made you think, please consider subscribing to The Hidden Truth, True Crime Story. New episodes drop regularly, each one exploring a new mystery, a new truth, a new story that deserves to be told. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and never forget that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who hide in plain sight.